We're going to cover the beginning of the Aramaic section of Daniel. Remember, we have three parts to Daniel. The first part is in Hebrew, and it's addressing the Israelites. The second part is in Aramaic, and is a discussion directed towards the Gentiles. And then the third part, which will be the prophetic message of Daniel, starts in chapter 7, and that goes back to Hebrew, and it addresses the Israelites once again. So we're going to start with the Aramaic section. This is starting with chapter 2, verse 4, and going through verse 19, if you're following along. All right, let's start off with a little review of where we are in history. So where are we with regards to Israel in history? You might remember that Judah is the last of the two pieces of Israel. There was the Israel in the north and Judah in the south. And Judah is the last one intact because of their rebellion, they're captured by Babylon. What I thought would be useful would be that we should cover first the scriptures that show, just a few of them of many, that show this was actually a predicted event. They had actually received enough warning that they should have known that this was coming. So who was it predicted by? Well, obviously it was dictated by God, but it was predicted by Isaiah in his writings. Let's take a look at one of his passages. In Isaiah 30, verses 1 to 5, notice the words that he's talking about. He's talking about sin, he's talking about Egypt, and he's talking about making an alliance. We'll see this come to pass when we talk about how this was fulfilled. Ah, stubborn children, declares the Lord, who carry out a plan, but not mine, and who make an alliance, but not of my spirit, that they may add sin to sin, who set out to go down to Egypt without asking for my direction, to take refuge in the protection of Pharaoh, and to seek shelter in the shadow of Egypt. Therefore shall the protection of Pharaoh turn to your shame, and the shelter in the shadow of Egypt to your humiliation. For though his officials are at Zoan, and his envoys reach Hanes, everyone comes to shame through a people that cannot profit them, that brings neither help nor profit, but shame and disgrace. Now, we often, when we think about Israel and Egypt, we think about the Exodus and how they all left Egypt. But at this point in time, at the end of Judah's history, there was still a sizable presence of Egypt, and they still controlled much of the Middle East. And that was all about to change. So reaching out to Pharaoh was a wrong idea, and that's what God was warning here in Isaiah. Now, this is Isaiah, who lived about a generation or two before Ezekiel and Daniel, who were contemporaries. The next warning we read from Ezekiel. This is in chapter 12, verses 10 to 13. Say to them, thus says the Lord, this oracle concerns the prince in Jerusalem. Notice it says prince and not king. And all the house of Israel who are in it. Say, I am a sign for you. As I have done, so shall it be done to them. They shall go into exile, into captivity, and the prince who is among them shall lift his baggage upon his shoulder at dusk and shall go out. That's very interesting phrasing. He's going to lift his bag like he's ready to leave. They shall dig through the wall to bring him out through it. He shall cover his face that he may not see the land with his eyes. And I will spread my net over him, and he shall be taken in my snare. So it sounds like he's not going to get very far. And I will bring him to Babylon, the land of the Chaldeans, yet he shall not see it, and he shall die there. Keep that in mind, that whoever this guy is, he's going to try to escape. He's not going to be able to escape, but he's not going to see where he's going. We'll see why that occurs. The other contemporary amongst amongst Daniel and Ezekiel were Jeremiah, also around at the little bit older than Daniel, but also going into the captivity in Babylon. He writes in chapter 11, verses 9 to 17, Again the Lord said to me, a conspiracy exists among the men of Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem. They have turned back to the iniquities of their forefathers, who refused to hear my words. This is stating what was actually happening in Judah. They were having a series of rebellions against God. They have gone after other gods to serve them. The house of Israel and the house of Judah have both broken my covenant that I made with their fathers. Therefore, thus says the Lord, behold, I am bringing disaster upon them, that they cannot escape. And though they cry to me, I will not listen. And the cities of Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem will go and cry to the gods whom they make their offerings, but they cannot save them in their times of trouble. For your gods have become as many as your cities, O Judah. Remember, Judah had many little cities. He's saying you have the same number of gods as you have cities. O Judah, and as many as the streets of Jerusalem are your altars that you have set up to shame, altars that you make offerings to Baal. Therefore, do not pray for this people. God is telling Jeremiah, do not pray for this people or lift up a cry of prayer on their behalf, for I will not listen when they call to me in their time of trouble. What right has my beloved in my house when she has done many vile deeds? Can even sacrificial flesh avert your doom? Can you then exult? The Lord once called you a green olive tree, beautiful with good fruit. But with the roar of a great tempest, he will set fire to it and its branches, and it will be consumed. The Lord of hosts who planted you has decreed disaster against you because of the evil that the house of Israel and the house of Judah have done, provoking me to make anger by making offerings to Baal. So these are the predictions of the disaster coming upon Judah. And so, just as it was predicted, it was also fulfilled. And there's a little bit of a timeline illustrating in the course of what I think is about 32 years, everything falling to pieces. This starts with the last good king of Judah. Remember, Israel, the nation up north, never had any good kings. They all sinned, one right after the other, some worse than others. They had prophets being brought to them to warn them, but they never turned back to God. In the southern kingdom, sometimes they would have a good king, and sometimes they would have a bad king, and they would often alternate because the sons of the good kings would often turn out to be nasty. And that was exactly as what happened here. The last good king of Judah, Josiah, died in 609 BC, and it's really sad that he died. He was such an obedient king, and yet for some reason, when both Necho II of Egypt, who was the pagan king of Egypt, marching into war, told him, I'm on a mission from God, your God, he didn't listen to him. And neither did he listen to Jeremiah, who told him not to go into battle. And yet Josiah, all stirred up, went into battle, and sure enough, got hit by an arrow, and he died on the battlefield in the battle with Egypt. Well, Jehoahaz was his youngest son, and the people selected him to be his successor. So Josiah's son Jehoahaz took over, but at this point they had been overcome by Egypt, and Necho deposed Jehoahaz, who he'd only been king for 3 months. So he replaced him with his older brother Jehoiakim. And what a bad choice that was. Jehoiakim was nasty. We're going to see how nasty he was. Look what he does. Necho also at the same time imposed a sizable tribute from Judah. Do you remember what tribute is? It's not like the credits in a movie. This tribute was like heavy taxation, really heavy taxation. In other words, everybody has to go out and basically scrape up everything they can just to pay this price back to the conquering nation, this nation being Egypt. And he brought Jehoahaz back to Egypt as his prisoner, and Jehoahaz ended up dying in Egypt as a prisoner. Necho then returned to assist Assyria in this big three-way circus that was going on at the time, where the king of Babylon was fighting, the king of Syria, the king of Assyria, and Egypt were all fighting together for control over the Middle East. So while Necho is going back to Assyria, Jehoiakim started out as a vassal king of Egypt. In other words, he wasn't a real king, he was taking orders from Necho. But after Egypt's temporary defeat with Babylon in 605, in which Nebuchadnezzar had not only defeated Egypt, he had also swept in and besieged Jerusalem. He changed alliances, Jehoiakim did, to avoid the destruction of Jerusalem by saying, I'm no longer answering to Egypt, I'm now answering to Nebuchadnezzar in Jerusalem. Jehoiakim paid tribute to Nebuchadnezzar at this point in time. In lots of money out of the treasury, all the temple artifacts, remember all the things that we hear about later on in Daniel, that's where they came from in this particular invasion that Nebuchadnezzar made against Jerusalem. He also delivered up some of the royal family and nobility as hostages, and that was the first deportation. And Daniel was one of these in this first group of exiles. This was all at 605 BC. But keep in mind, we have Necho and we have Nebuchadnezzar and we have other kings all coming down, doing their business in Jerusalem, making a mess, and then running back and fighting other battles. So while this is going on, things go from bad to worse in Israel, or rather in Judah. Jehoiakim was terrible. He was one of the worst. You should look up some of the history on him. He even made himself proud of the fact that he was more rebellious than his grandfather. Remember, his father Josiah was a righteous man, but his grandfather before him was not. Jehoiakim prided himself in the fact that he was the worst of the worst. And if you read of what he did, he was terrible. You might remember that one passage in 2 Kings where one of the last kings of Egypt, last kings of Judah, is listening to the prophecy from Jeremiah being read off of scroll. And after they stopped at each paragraph, he would take a knife, slice it off, and throw it in the fire. In other words, he was defiantly saying, I don't care what you're reading. This is the guy that did that. Jehoiakim was a bad guy. Bad guy. He continued to be the vassal of Babylon for 3 more years. But remember, Babylon and Egypt are fighting back and forth, and sometimes they win, sometimes they lose. At 601, Egypt was strong enough to weaken the control of Babylon in this area. So he switched his alliance back to Egypt. So we're playing both sides of the game, but really not giving him any honor. Well, you don't do that to Nebuchadnezzar. You don't turn on him. And just a couple of years after that, in 598 BC, he reinvaded Judah and again besieged Jerusalem for 3 months. Now, you know what the word siege means? Anybody know what the word siege means? It means blockade. It means cutting off all supplies going in or out of a city. And these are walled cities, so it's actually pretty easy to do. They just put their soldiers all around it, and they would kill anybody who tried to leave or anybody who tried to come in. And eventually, the city would starve. People would run out of food, they would run out of supplies, and they would eventually acquiesce. And that's how they would subdue their captives. That's how they would take a city down. Siegement is nasty stuff. It's really bad for the people. And if it lasts a long time, it gets even worse. We'll find out about this. This is the second attack that Nebuchadnezzar makes on Jerusalem. And Jehoiakim died before the siege ended, but he didn't die in Jerusalem. He was actually captured, put in fetters, and dragged off back to Babylon, and he died in Babylon. But that's not all. Jehoiakim was succeeded by his son Jehoiachin. I'm sorry if the names are confusing, and they're even more confusing because I'm only giving you one of the names that these people have. These guys grew up with a different name, and then when they took on their position of authority, they were handed a different name, and I'm giving you the names that they were handed. So Jehoiakim was the father of Jehoiachin. Jehoiachin took over, but he only reigned for about 3 months. Nebuchadnezzar thought, I just killed his dad. He's probably going to try to do something nasty to avenge his father's death. So he deposed him. And who did he put in place? Zedekiah. Zedekiah was the younger brother in this case of Jehoiachin. And so he sets up Zedekiah, and then the royal household at this point was exiled to Babylon, as well as much of the population. At this point, the entire nation is basically emptied except for a few people that could hang around to take care of these the plants and things. And this was usually the poorest of the nation that was left behind. But this was it. This is the official fall of Jerusalem. And I even put the date on here, March 16th, although they didn't use today's calendar. It would equate to March 16th back in 597 BC. And that's important to remember because that marks the beginning of the 70 years that they were to be in exile. So that's Zedekiah. Was Zedekiah one of the good guys? No, he wasn't. In 596, Nebuchadnezzar, after taking care of this, went back home and he took care of a threatened invasion from the area now known as Iran. And he took care of that. And he also put down an internal rebellion that was going on in his army trying to fight against him. In every case, Nebuchadnezzar is quick to get there and quick to put it down. He did the right kind of thing to keep control of his nation. And then after dealing with all that, he goes back up north to Syria to keep fighting in this three-way war that kept on going. Well, of course, when the cat's away, the mice will play, right? During this time, Zedekiah thought, nobody likes to be under Nebuchadnezzar's rule. Why don't we make an alliance with all the other vassal kings and overthrow them? So he makes an alliance with Pharaoh Hophra. This is another Pharaoh, not Necho. Did Necho make Necho wafers? That's a different Necho, isn't it? Anyway, Pharaoh Hophra of Egypt and stage a revolt against Babylon, hoping to unite the other vassal nations to defeat them. And remember, Nebuchadnezzar doesn't like rebellion. So what happens? Nebuchadnezzar responded by invading Judah again. He began a siege of Jerusalem in 589. And this siege, folks, this was the bad one. This siege lasted about 30 months. That's 2.5 years. 2.5 years of no supplies, everything getting cut off. This is when Judah drank the cup of God's wrath, as prophesied. This was the bad one where they turned to cannibalism, where they were just completely defeated and drained. This was the bad thing. And anybody left in Jerusalem was destroyed because Jerusalem just was wiped out by Nebuchadnezzar at this point. So this is the end of Zedekiah's reign. He'd only reigned for about 11 years at this point. He and his followers tried to escape out of the city, but they were captured near Jericho. Remember one of the prophecies? Was that Isaiah, or was that, no, it was Jeremiah, saying that they'll try to escape, putting the bag over his sack or over his shoulder and get out, but he was captured near Jericho, on the plains near Jericho. And so what does Nebuchadnezzar do? Well, he takes him to Babylon. He puts his son to death right in front of Zedekiah, and then he puts his eyes out. This nasty stuff, and we always remember that. Is this one of the things that these pagan kings would do? Is they would put out the eyes of the people that they captured, and Zedekiah ended up dying in Babylon just as it was prophesied. And this was the end of the Davidic dynasty, but it wasn't the end of the Davidic line. Who was the one that needed to stay in the Davidic line that eventually becomes the king? It's the King of Kings. It's our King. That's Jesus. He's the part of the Davidic line that survived even after all this. Okay? So that's the history of what happened in that last 32 years of Israel. At this point, we have to remember Daniel's already been to Babylon, and he's already gone through his training course, if you could call that, the brainwashing that they were trying to do. But Daniel is outshining everybody else, all the other wise men that were in there. And just to recap, this is what we read in the last chapter. As for these 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions, dreams, and so forth. And in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of him, he found Daniel and his friends 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in his kingdom. That could be prose, or that could be literal, that he was actually very smart. I would choose the latter, I would think, because when God wants to emphasize something, he does. So, we're talking about Daniel, we're talking about Judah. What about this guy Nebuchadnezzar? We really haven't covered him very much. So, what I thought we could do is we could take just a few moments to go on the background of Nebuchadnezzar. Now, when you think of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, you think godless tyrant, right? Well, actually, there's a little bit more to him than that. Let's cover what this is all about. Now, you remember, he's the son, the eldest son of Nabopolassar, the original guy who restored the Chaldean kingdom to glory. The Chaldean kingdom has been around for a long time. Chaldeans have been around for 10 centuries. At this point, they had been here for 400 years, and Babylon itself is 2,000 years old by the time they were setting this all up. So it's an ancient civilization that was having a renaissance of sorts under Nabopolassar, and then Nebuchadnezzar II rises to power after his father dies. Nebuchadnezzar was born around 630, and he lived altogether about 70 years. So a good long life for a pagan king. He began his military career very young and even was remarked as a military administrator. That means guy in charge. And he's only 20 years old at this point. So he's really shining in military capability. He proves himself to be a skilled general. In 607, as crown prince, he commanded an army to go down to Assyria, leading independent operations. And this little picture over here is actually like the newsprint, a story about his success in Assyria. And after a Babylonian setback, a temporary setback in Egypt, remember they had been fighting back and forth, he served as commander-in-chief in his father's place, and he went on to defeat the army at Carchemish and Hamath, and therefore he secured control of all the area that Egypt was trying to control, which would include Syria. And then on his father's death, he returned to Babylon in a really quick trip, only about 3 weeks, where he ascends to the throne, then he comes right back. This is an indication that he didn't have to stick around. This is an indication that he already had a strong grip on the kingdom. People were for him and not against him. So he successfully became a popular king. And in 604 BC, from Syria to the Palestine area, he subdued many of the local states, including Judah. So he put down various rebellions, and then he secured a very long reign. Now, it wasn't just after all these rebellions were put down, he becomes like the center of the world. Babylon becomes really an important place in the world. He was also a religious man, and this one surprised me. I thought, well, maybe he worshipped himself, and he certainly had a big ego. But he was a religious man right from the start. He didn't necessarily worship Yahweh, but he worshipped the temple, or worshipped a god named Marduk. And one of his first assignments that was recorded by his father was he was given a chance to be a laborer in the restoration of the temple of Marduk. Remember, Babylon had been around for 2,000 years. This temple had actually fallen into ruin. And what they did is they had their own religious renaissance worshiping Marduk. And right at the center of it was Nebuchadnezzar. On ascending to the throne, he prayed this inaugural address. This was, I forgot the name of the historian who wrote this down. O merciful Marduk, may the house that I have built endure forever, and may I be satiated with his splendor, attain old age therein, with abundant offspring, and receive therein tribute of all the kings of all religions from all mankind. See, he wasn't a godless person. He did worship. He did have focus on honoring a god. It wasn't the god, but he didn't know that. But notice that he said, from all mankind. He considered himself the evangelist to the world for Marduk, Marduk being the god of Babylonia. So he continued the expansion of Babylon. He claimed grant of universal kingship, which is something his father didn't do. He sort of took on the air that he was representative of Marduk, and he prayed that he would have no opponent from horizon to sky, which is basically everywhere. He saw himself as the defender of the faith. Here, by the way, is a picture of Marduk. This is called Marduk and his pet, which I thought would be funny because what if his pet was named Marmaduke, right? Marduk. Anyway, he was also a builder. He really, really brought up Babylon to be a shining jewel in the Middle East. His main activity, other than being a military commander, was rebuilding. He completed and extended the fortifications around the city, including building a great moat. And in addition to the wall that was already there, he built a new outer defense wall. It became a tremendous place. He built the ceremonial processional way. This is he paved it, by the way, with limestone and decorated with all those fancy glazed bricks that you sometimes see in the news when they're talking about ancient artifacts. There's a picture here of the Ishtar Gate, which has a few of those glazed bricks with lions and bulls on them. He built a stone bridge over the Euphrates, which was quite a feat because that's a big river. He embellished the principal temples. I wrote templates, that's wrong. Temples, and he cut canals. So he really did a lot of work to make Babylon a jewel of the Middle East. It was really a remarkable city, and it's huge too. He built the famous Hanging Gardens. Everybody's heard of the Hanging Gardens, one of the 7 wonders of the world. Why did he do this? Because he married a Median princess, this prince of the Medes, And she'd grown up in Persia where there was mountains, and she was lonely because Babylon's in a very flat area. So he built the Hanging Garden supposedly to make her feel at home being in a mountainous area. So, you know, if your wife is unhappy, you're going to make her happy by building huge things. So, so even today, the ruins of Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon are spread over 2,000 acres. It's huge, and it forms the largest archaeological site to this day in the Middle East. It's absolutely huge. So, was he cruel and egotistical like we've always thought? He certainly was egotistical. We have no doubt about that. There's plenty of evidence of that, even in Daniel's passages. In the dream in today's passage, that didn't help any. We'll find out next week what that dream is, where he's actually the head of gold. Oh, that probably did a good number on his ego. But was he excessively cruel? He was cruel, but he wasn't any more cruel than the other kings at that time. I mean, the king of Assyria also cut the thumbs off of his vassal kings, the ones that he defeated, and put eyes out of his prisoners. So he wasn't exceptionally cruel, but he was a bad guy. But he was also in charge of the whole world, and a lot of people looked up to him. In one of the other passages we'll read, often I believe it's chapter 4, there's a prophecy that says he's like a tree giving life to all of the nations all around him. So I'm sure that didn't help his ego anyway. But he was more than just a tyrant. He was a good leader. He was an effective leader, I should say. There's no one good but God. But he was certainly not a bad choice to take over Judah and take them captive. They could have been torn asunder by a worse king. But Nebuchadnezzar and later Cyrus, they all actually took good care of Israel, and they weren't as cruel as they could have been. So I'm just putting it that way. All right, so Daniel's here in the court of Babylon. Let's talk a little bit about the situation that Daniel finds himself in where we begin our story. Now, Daniel says that he's in the Babylonian court with other advisors. What kind of advisors? Daniel lists 4 different kinds. Let's talk about them. There's magicians. Now, we think of magicians today as people doing tricks, but in actual fact, the word magician here is translated from the Hebrew chartumim, if I can pronounce that correctly. This name really is derived from a writing instrument, either a pen or a stylus or whatever. These guys were the ones who were in charge of incantations, and they were the learned ones that would write things down. So these were the magicians. Now, what we normally think of a magician would be the enchanters. These are the guys that were necromancers. That means they talked to the dead. They were the fortune tellers. But these are the guys that often used the visual tricks, like a sleight of hand and things like that. They did these things not for entertainment purposes, but sort of to purport that they are acting with the spirits. So these things are all happening and balls are floating in the air, not because of the hidden strings, but because they're supposedly talking with the spirits that are helping them out. In addition to the magicians and enchanters, we also have sorcerers, and these are both male and female people who transform things. Do you remember back in Egypt's time? Remember when Moses would come up and he would toss his staff down and would become a snake? Well, this is the transformation kind of thing these guys would take care of. So just like in the magicians in Pharaoh's court, these are the ones that can do unusual transformation things. In addition to these 3 guys, we have the Chaldeans. Now, this is kind of a confusing term. This was the nation of the Chaldeans. Babylon was the modern day version of what had been around for many, many centuries. But by this point in time, the word Chaldean really meant more of a priestly class, sort of like the upper class, the expert astrologers, the people who could track the planets, and they would be really the ones that you would see to as the learned of these wise men. And you'll find that of all the people talking, they're the ones that speak up first when Nebuchadnezzar makes his request that we're going to cover later. So why did Daniel list 4 different kinds of advisors? I mean, he could have said just the wise men. He did this on purpose as a way of emphasizing that God is superior to all of them. He's superior to magicians, superior to necromancers, he's superior to anybody else. So that was an emphasis on the importance of God over human beings. By the way, did you notice that Daniel and his friends, they're considered part of the wise men, but they're not part of these groups? That's a good thing. They're still considered the wise men, but they're not magicians, they're not sorcerers, and they're certainly not Chaldeans, being from Judah. All right. Now, last week we sort of touched on the first 3 verses of Daniel 2. We're going to cover those again. This is the last part of the Hebrew section of Daniel before we get into the Aramaic section. All right? This is all about the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had. In the 2nd year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. His spirit was troubled, and his sleep left him. Then the king commanded that magicians, enchanters, and sorcerers and Chaldeans be summoned to tell the king his dreams. So they came in and stood before the king, and the king said to them, I had a dream, and my spirit is troubled to know the dream. Let's look at the important parts of this. In the 2nd year, now, some commentators think that the 2nd year must have been like midway through this 3-year training session that Daniel had, because when Daniel was brought in, that was when Nebuchadnezzar had first taken the throne. But other commentators, and I thought this was kind of important, say that the Babylonian pattern was to not count the 1st year as the 1st year of his reign. The ascension year was like the startup year, and the first real reign was the first full year he was in office. So this 2nd year was actually at or just after Daniel's 3rd year of his training. And this would jive better with what we saw in the 1st chapter, where they said after this period of time, meaning after the 3-year training, Nebuchadnezzar found him to be 10 times better than the other guys. So that works out pretty good. Whatever the case, in the 2nd year, he had this horrible dream. And this was important, especially to the leaders of the ancient world. They thought that the dreams were foreshadowing of future events, so they took them seriously. So the king's dreams had significance for the nation as well, because after all, he's in charge of the whole nation. So if the dream says to go one way, they're going to go one way. If the dream says to go the other way, they're going to go the other way. They're seeing this as a guide to their future. So Nebuchadnezzar has a staff of specialists all march in, and they were always on hand for this sort of thing anyway, because you never knew when you're going to have a dream. And so here we come to the challenge and the response. The challenge from the king, his request, and the response from the wise men. All right? This is the beginning of our passage that begins the Aramaic section of Daniel. Then the Chaldeans said to the king in Aramaic, O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will show the interpretation. The king answered and said to the Chaldeans, the word from me is firm. If you do not make known to me the dream and its interpretation, you'll be torn limb from limb, and your houses shall be laid in ruins. But if you show the dream and its interpretation, you'll receive gifts from me and rewards and great honor. Therefore, show me the dream and its interpretation. If you want to remember where the Aramaic section starts, it says right there in English. The Chaldean said to the king in Aramaic, and from this point through the rest of chapter 6, we're in Aramaic. So, interesting. By the way, Aramaic and Hebrew are very, very similar. So the fact that Aramaic was very popular usually meant that anybody could speak Hebrew could also speak Aramaic, because they would learn the language very easily. So the wise men are ready to conduct business as usual. Yes, sir, tell us the dream and we'll tell you the interpretation. Sure you will. Nebuchadnezzar is having none of this. He wants to prove that they're really the experts they say they are. The word is firm. The word is firm was something that it's translated in different English versions of the Bible to different things. But really what is he's saying here is he's saying that a royal order has been made and you cannot rescind it. My word is firm on this. I've made my decision. This is what's going to happen. All right. So this is Nebuchadnezzar's incentive plan. If they fail, they'll be dismembered and their house is laid in ruins. This is pretty serious business. It doesn't mean that they're just going to go and tear his house down. This probably means that they're going to kill all of his family too. So anybody who's got family, he's looking forward to not only being fired, but everything going away. But the other side is, if they succeed, they'll be rewarded handsomely. And who could reward anybody handsomer than Nebuchadnezzar, who was in charge of the whole world at this point? Is this an extraordinary demand driven by Nebuchadnezzar's ego? Or was it extraordinary demand he was making because he suspected that his experts were phonies? Or was this just because he was religiously driven and he wanted to see something happen that was miraculous? Well, could have been all three. But regardless of what his motivation was, God's motivation was setting the plan up to magnify his glory. So no matter why he said this, this was being said for God's sake. So verses 7 to 11, they answered a second time and said, "Let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will show its interpretation." The king answered and said, "I know with certainty that you're trying to gain time because you see the word from me as firm. If you do not make the dream known to me, but there's but one sentence for you. You agreed to speak lying and corrupt words before me until the times change. Therefore tell me the dream, and I know that you can show me its interpretation." The Chaldeans answered the king and said, "There's not a man on earth who can meet the king's demand, for no great and powerful king has asked such a thing of any magician or any enchanter or any Chaldean. The thing that the king asks is difficult, and no one can show it to the king except the gods whose dwelling is not with flesh." Let's take a look at this. Nebuchadnezzar's calling them out for buying time. He says, "I know that you're trying to gain time." So he reiterates his threat because he knows they're not being honest. He's suspecting that they're just going to make something up, and he doesn't want that to be happening. He says, "Until the times change." That's kind of a funny phrase. If you look in different versions of English, you'll see what he's trying to say is, you're just trying to buy time until I change my mind or until the whole thing blows over, and then you can go back to work as usual. He's not buying that. So what he's laying down is, you tell me the dream, and then I'll know for sure that you can interpret this properly. Okay? The Chaldeans said, this is unreasonable by any human terms. But that's the key, human terms. They're still thinking in human terms. Notice in their own words, they reveal the power of Israel's God, Yahweh, our God, who says that what they say is impossible, he can do it. He's not only the holy and high God whose glory fills the heavens, but he's also the God whose spirit dwells with men. Quoting Isaiah 57:15, "For thus says the one who is high and lifted up, who inhabits eternity, whose name is holy. I dwell in the high and holy place, and also with him who is of a contrite and lowly spirit, to revive the spirit of the lowly and to revive the heart of the contrite." He's in heaven, he's high, he's glorious, he's also nearby, he's with us. Isn't that wonderful? So because of this, the king was angry and very furious, and he commanded that all the wise men of Babylon be destroyed. So the decree went out, and the wise men were about to be killed, and they sought Daniel and his companions to kill them too. So the king's conclusion, it's time for a staff change. We're going to get rid of all the old guys. We're going to get some new wise men. Notice that Daniel and his companions are included in this order, even though they weren't part of the party that went to see the king. So, then Daniel replied with prudence and discretion. Notice that that's different than how Nebuchadnezzar acts. He acts, bang, everything is all out there. But Daniel is replying with wisdom, and he's approaching the whole thing carefully. So he goes to Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, who'd gone out to kill the wise men, and instead of just pleading for his life, he says, "What's going on? Why is the decree of the king so urgent?" Then Arioch made the matter known to Daniel, and Daniel went in and requested of the king to appoint a time that he might show the interpretation to the king. Notice the timing on this. This is really interesting. First, Daniel doesn't go into a panic, but calmly finds out what the facts are. He goes to with discretion to the captain of the king's guard. And what's his first move? His first move is to request an appointment with the king. He's making an act of faith. He's stepping out on faith. He does this even before he prays or gets into revelation from God. That's bold. That's a good lesson for us. Is this putting God on the spot? Well, kinda. If we say, I really could use a new car, and you go out and you buy a new car, and then you pray that God's going to help you find the money to find the car, that may not be right. Consider the fact that it's not putting God on the spot if you are acting according to God's purpose and will, and you know that you're acting according to his will. What is God's purpose? God's purpose is to glorify himself by making us love him. And of course, bringing us up and giving us a chance to love him is something that only he does to us or through us, and it's not something we can do on our own. So this is all magnifying God by his purpose and will. So what Daniel's doing is he's acting on God's will. He knows that his life is at stake and the life of his companions, as well as his co-workers, the enchanters and all the others, they're all about to lose their lives. Daniel steps out in faith because he knows that's his only option. And he knows that only God can fix this problem. So Daniel went to his house. This was probably a house somewhere within the palace of Babylon. And he made the matter known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah's companions, and told them to seek mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that Daniel and his companions might not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Then the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision of the night. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. So he goes to his friends for assistance and prayer. In this, Daniel demonstrates the right response. Not only is he doing the right thing, but he's also demonstrating to his friends the right thing to do, to pray to the one true God for insight. And God reveals the mystery. And this is in contrast, you'll notice, to the gods of Babylonian diviners who aren't gods at all. God gave the answer to Daniel, where no answer could otherwise arise. Daniel immediately blesses and thanks God. Immediately. He doesn't wait for anything else to happen. He immediately thanks God for the answer to this riddle that eventually saves the lives of all the wise men, including himself and his friends. He doesn't wait. He thanks God right away. So this is a good lesson, and we got all sorts of good things to learn from it. So what's the first lesson? God is in control. Not fake gods, not people, not kings, not presidents, not prime ministers. God is in control. What man considers impossible is possible to God. The intentions of the rulers of this world have no sway over God's divine power. God and only God is in full control, and he will see his will done. We can rely on that. We can trust in that. We can rejoice in that. Sometimes you have to act in faith, just like Daniel did. Be sure when you do that you are in alignment with God's plan. You ever worry, what's God's plan for me? It's spelled out very clearly. We are here to glorify God. Anything that's going to be glorifying God in its root effort is in alignment with his plan. So you can step out in faith if you know for sure that that's exactly how it's going to work out. Ask yourself, is this for God's glory, or am I doing this for my own glory? Am I buying a car because I want a car, or am I buying a car because my family absolutely needs it and I've got some obligations that I need to fulfill? And you can pray about it at that point with full confidence that God's going to help. There's a benefit to praying together. This is something that we saw with Daniel coming to his friends. God knows the end from the beginning. He already knows what you need before you ask for it. Remember in Matthew 6. But prayer is a tool for us. God gives us prayer to communicate with him. It's for strengthening our relationship with him. And praying together strengthens our unity because it helps us focus on God, and others can petition for you when you don't have the strength or the knowledge to fill in. Other people can fill in for you. That's why it's always such a benefit for us to pray with each other. The last lesson is to be thankful. Always be ready to be thankful. God can act at any time, and we should be thankful. Thankfulness honors God. And in addition to being obedience, thankfulness is one of those ways, one of the best ways to show love to God.